So many people dream about being able to travel around the world in business class, but oftentimes let that dream die because they either think that it's going to cost them way too much money or cost them millions in frequent flyer points. But what if I told you that you could fly around the world in business class with the same amount of Qantas points that's required to fly from Melbourne to London, return in business class? Sounds a little too good to be true, but with the OneWorld Classic reward flight, this is all possible. And the best thing is that this is by far the best use of those Qantas points that's going to give you the most amount of value for your points. So we're going to cover everything that you need to know about the OneWorld Classic reward flight in this video. We'll talk about what it is, how many points you need to book this reward flight, what the rules are that you'll need to follow, and then we'll go over some sample itineraries that you could create. And then finally, we'll talk about how to actually go about booking this flight. And I'll even leave some tips and tricks at the end, so make sure you stay around for that. Okay, so what is the OneWorld Classic reward flight? Well, the OneWorld Award is a special type of reward flight that lets you fly with any OneWorld Alliance member up to a maximum of 35,000 miles, which is enough for a round the world journey. However, you don't need to travel around the world if you don't want to. And we'll see that later on in the sample itineraries that we'll go over. Now, you might be thinking that this is going to cost an arm and a leg in Qantas points to be able to book this reward flight. But surprisingly, it doesn't actually cost too many points, especially when you take into consideration the distance that you'll be traveling. I mean, we're talking about the ability to travel around the world and essentially visit every continent on your trip. So Qantas has 4 different classic flight reward tables on their website, which tells you how many points you'll need to book certain reward flights. Now, the one that we'll be talking about today is the OneWorld Classic reward flight table. From this table, we can see how many points it would cost us based on the different cabin classes and the total distance that we plan to cover in our itinerary. If we wanted to maximize the distance traveled and have up to 35,000 miles, then this booking in economy would cost us a relatively modest 132,400 points, 249,600 points in premium economy, 318,000 points in business class, or 455,000 points in first class, plus any taxes and fees added on top. Now, whilst economy may seem pretty attractive because it actually doesn't cost too many points to redeem that reward flight, in my opinion, business class is the sweet spot. You get significantly more value from your points in comparison to the economy reward booking. There'll be plenty of airlines and flights to choose from across the OneWorld Alliance fleet, and plus you'll get lounge access for every one of your flights. Premium economy isn't available on all airlines, so it's going to be quite difficult to put together a full itinerary. And as for first class, that's also going to be pretty hard to book because most airlines these days also don't offer first class either. Now, there are quite a few rules that you'll need to follow when booking these flights. Firstly, you must fly with at least 2 OneWorld airlines that isn't Qantas. In fact, you don't even have to fly with Qantas if you don't want to. Secondly, you can have a maximum of 5 stopovers only. Now, a stopover is whenever you have more than 24 hours between 2 flights. So these are essentially going to be the main cities that you'll be visiting. Now, when you land in one city, you can depart from another city, and that's still going to be considered as one stopover. So you don't need to depart from the same city in which you flew into. The third rule is that you can have a maximum of 16 individual segments. A segment is each individual flight, which includes transits under 24 hours, and also any journeys that you make over land yourself. These land or surface segments that you make yourself will also be counted towards the 35,000 mile maximum and is calculated by the distance between the 2 airports that you'll be either arriving in and then departing from. So for example, if I flew from Melbourne to London via a transit in Dubai and then took the Eurostar in London to Amsterdam and then took a flight to Madrid, that would be counted as 4 individual segments because there's the transit in Dubai, which is the first segment, then the flight to London, which is the second, and then I take the Eurostar myself, which is considered the surface segment, and then finally the flight out of Amsterdam, which is the fourth segment. The fourth rule is that you can have no more than one stopover or 2 transits through the one airport. You also have 12 months to complete your travels, and if you mix different classes, then the highest class will be used to calculate the total cost. Meaning just one first class flight in an otherwise all business class itinerary will make the cost jump up to that $455,000 first class price. Once you return to your country of origin, then you can't leave it again. And lastly, you don't actually need to return to the original city from where you departed from. But the distance between your starting city and your ending city will also be calculated towards the 35,000 mile maximum. Okay, so now that we've got the boring rules out of the way, what are some sample itineraries that we could create with this round the world trip? Because you can literally fly anywhere and in whatever direction you want as long as you comply with the rules that I just talked about. There are absolutely no restrictions on how many continents you can visit. If you wanted to revisit a continent again later in your trip, then you definitely can do that. And if you wanted to make some land segments of your own, then you can actually visit way more than 5 destinations with your stopovers. For example, you could fly into Rome from Melbourne, then take the high train speed to Florence, then again to Venice, and then when you're at Venice, you could hire a car and visit the Dolomites before driving to see Lake Como, and then driving back to Milan and then flying out from there. And that would only count as one single stopover. And the added distance to your trip is the distance between the Rome and Milan airports. So here's an example of a round the world trip where we visit multiple continents. So we would depart from Sydney to Hong Kong as our first stop, then fly to Helsinki as our second stop, then we would make our own way to Paris, which is a surface segment, then fly to Marrakesh as our third stop, make our own way to Casablanca, before flying all the way to New York City as our fourth stop. Then we would make our own way to San Francisco, fly to Lima as our fifth and final stop, and then make your own way to San Diego, and then fly home back to Sydney. So that's a pretty comprehensive round the world trip. But remember, you don't actually need to fly around the world if you don't want to. Instead, you could actually do a loop around a specific region and actually crisscross between different continents. And actually, you don't even need to start in Australia as well. For example, we could start in Singapore, fly to Hong Kong as our first stop, then fly to San Francisco as our second stop, make our own way to Dallas, and then fly back to Sydney as our third stop, fly to Queensland as our fourth stop, and then fly all the way to Tokyo as our fifth stop before returning back home to Melbourne. Okay, so how do you book this OneWorld Classic reward flight? Now, I'm not gonna lie to you guys, it can be a very time-consuming process to actually book this reward flight, because finding business seats on popular routes is tricky in and of itself. So don't expect to complete this booking in one single sitting. Instead, you'll need to build this itinerary out over several weeks, if not several months, depending on how long you're traveling for. And the booking process will usually require several calls to Qantas to help you with your booking. So here's some tips that will hopefully help you with your reward flight booking. Firstly, start planning early, and ideally more than a year in advance, and research which specific flights you want to book and when those reward seats will typically be released by that airline. Second, be flexible with your dates and the destinations that you're flying in and out of. If you're not sure which routes are covered by OneWorld Alliance members, then check out this OneWorld Alliance route map from Flight Connections, which shows every route that every OneWorld Alliance member flies. Thirdly, you should be using Qantas's multi-city search tool to search for each individual leg. Whilst it is designed for multi-leg flights, it also works for individual flights as well, and it has the advantage of giving you a monthly calendar view, unlike the single default option. Just make sure to select the Use Points button and be flexible with all your flights. As an alternative, you can also use British Airways or American Airlines because they also show OneWorld Alliance reward flights. The fourth tip is to book the initial flight yourself on the Qantas site. If you can use the multi-city tool and book several legs in one go, then definitely go ahead and lock that in. And then once you've booked that, later on you can actually add more legs to that same itinerary. You just need to call Qantas up to change your flight and then add that leg to your overall itinerary. You will be charged 5,000 points per person whenever you make a change using the Qantas call center, so make sure you account for that in your overall points booking. The reason why we have to do this is because you can't make a series of individual bookings with different reference numbers and then ask Qantas to stitch them all together at the end. Tip number 5 is to make sure you calculate the total miles of your itinerary. The last thing you want to do is exceed that 35,000 mile limit. And you can check the total miles for your itinerary by using the Great Circle Mapper tool. Just type in the airport codes separated by hyphens and it will give you the total miles for your itinerary. Tip number 6 is to book seats as soon as they become available. The last thing that you want to happen is to have someone else snap up your reward seats. Airlines release reward seats at different times, usually between 330 to 360 days ahead of time. They also sometimes release them in batches, so you'll need to keep an eye out on when those reward seats become available. Tip number 7 is if you do decide to cancel your whole itinerary, then you will be refunded all the points and any taxes and fees that you've paid already, less the 6,000 Qantas points cancellation fee per person. So that's all I had to share with you guys in regards to the OneWorld Classic reward flight. This is easily the best use of your Qantas points possible, and whilst booking it is definitely complex, it's definitely worth it given the experience that you'll have. If you've enjoyed today's video, then make sure to hit that like button down below because it really does help out the channel, and subscribe for more travel related content in the future. Now, if you watched this far, leave me a comment with the word travel down below so I know you've watched all the way. Now, you'll definitely need to save quite a few points to do this trip comfortably for 2 people. But it's definitely worth it, and the best way to accumulate a large number of Qantas points in the shortest amount of time possible is by doing something called credit card hacking. And if you want to learn all about that, then make sure you check out this video right here, and I'll see you guys in next week's video.